At 05:30 on the morning of December 17th in the year 1944, Lieutenant Colonel David Perrin stood inside a frozen command post in the town of Malmedy in Belgium, watching his radio teams track a fast-moving armored column that had just torn through the American front line 8 miles to the east. He was only 26 years old, yet he had spent 8 months commanding the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, and he had absolutely no experience stopping a spearhead of German panzers. The force advancing toward him was Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by the feared SS officer Jochen Peiper, and it carried 5,000 Waffen-SS soldiers along with more than 100 tanks, including 45 of the massive Tiger, 2 heavy tanks. Their mission was brutally clear: break through to Antwerp, split the Allied front in two, win the war for Germany. Perrin commanded 600 combat engineers, not infantry, not tank destroyer crews. These were men trained to build bridges and clear minefields. They carried rifles, but their true weapons were blocks of explosives, coils of detonator wire, and a deep understanding of how to destroy structures with precision. The German surprise attack had shattered the First Army line. American infantry divisions were collapsing in confusion. Tank units were scrambling to regroup. Entire battalions were surrendering or pulling back in panic as the German armor advanced with terrifying speed. The 99th Infantry Division was being cut apart at Elsenborn Ridge. The 106th Infantry Division had been broken and scattered. Roads were packed with retreating American soldiers. In the middle of this chaos, Perrin received his orders at 06:15. He was told to set up roadblocks south and east of Malmedy to defend the town and to delay Kampfgruppe Peiper. He would receive no reinforcements. He had no heavy weapons, no armor. Only 600 engineers with their rifles and whatever explosives they could gather. Peiper was already capturing towns along the route. He had taken Hansfeld at dawn and seized fuel from American depots. He had taken vehicles and weapons. His lead tanks were pushing toward 3 key bridges at Abermont-Thioplan and Neuf Mule. If Peiper captured any of those crossings intact, his armor would pour into open terrain. Nothing would then stand between him and the Meuse River, and nothing would stand between the Meuse and Antwerp. Perrin studied his map and realized the ground itself was his only advantage. The Ardennes was thick with forests, steep hills, narrow roads, and valleys cut by twisting rivers. Every bridge mattered. The Germans could not advance without them. If the bridges stood, Peiper would burst through. If the bridges fell, his advance would stall. Perrin made his decision. Every bridge must be destroyed before the enemy reached it, not after a firefight had begun. Not while a Tiger was already firing on them. Before. His men would watch for the German columns, judge the perfect moment, wire the explosives, and then drop the bridge in front of the advancing armor. It was a mission many believed to be a death sentence. Engineers working in the open on a bridge were easy targets. They could be spotted by tank crews and machine gunners. One mistake in timing and the panzers would capture the crossing intact. 1 second of hesitation and the engineers would be run over. The demolition teams would often still be on the structure when the first enemy vehicles appeared. Some officers argued against Perrin. They believed the plan was reckless. They advised falling back to stronger positions farther west. They insisted infantry or armor should deal with the German attack. Engineers were not supposed to fight mechanized SS units. They were supposed to support infantry, not destroy bridges in front of Tiger tanks. Perrin rejected every objection. His battalion understood demolitions. They knew where to place charges and how to weaken a span. Their only question was whether they had the courage to stand firm while enemy tanks rolled toward them. The first test came at the stone bridge at Abermont, which crossed the Ambulve River. C Company received the assignment with Lieutenant Bucky Walters leading 23 men. They carried enough explosives to bring the bridge down. Walters set his team on the bridge at 0700. They placed charges against the stone supports, ran the wires to a covered position 50 yards to the west, and waited. At 0742, German reconnaissance vehicles appeared on the far bank. Half-tracks and scout cars raced toward the bridge with the first Tigers behind them. Walters watched them through binoculars, counting the distance while keeping his hand on the detonator. The Germans closed to 400 yards, then 300, then 200. His men asked if they should blow the bridge, but he said nothing. He waited 150 yards, 100. The lead vehicle reached the approach. Walters could see the driver. He could see the SS markings. He could see the machine gunner turning his weapon. Walters squeezed the detonator. The blast hurled the center of the bridge upward 6 feet. Massive stones flew through the air. The bridge was gone, and the lead half-track plunged into the river far below. The lead German half-track tried to stop, but the weight and speed of the vehicle carried it forward into the empty space where the stone span had been, and it dropped nearly 20 feet into the freezing river below, while the second vehicle halted, then reversed as SS soldiers scrambled out. It opened fire across the water toward the American engineers, who were already withdrawing to their next position, because their mission at Abimont was complete. The destroyed crossing forced camp, Grupp Peiper to reroute, and the delay gave First Army precious minutes to reorganize, yet Peiper did not slow. His column immediately swung south toward the larger twin bridges at Thioplan, which crossed both the Ambulv and the Salm rivers. If Peiper reached those 2 bridges intact, he would gain a direct road to the Meuse, and nothing would stand between him and the wide open terrain leading toward Antwerp. Only 12 engineers under Sergeant Robert Billington guarded Thioplan. They had no heavy weapons, no anti-tank guns, only rifles and explosives. Perrin understood how desperate the situation was, and at 0830 he radioed Billington and ordered him to prepare both bridges for demolition using every pound of explosive he possessed. Billington and his small team rushed to the first bridge, which was a steel and concrete structure far stronger than the stone bridge at Abimont. They placed explosive packs at every vulnerable joint and support point, doubling the usual charge because they had no time to calculate precise loads. They worked with cold hands and breath turning to mist as they hurried to finish before the Germans arrived. Then they moved to the second bridge, an older stone arch over the Salm. They drilled into the keystones, packed the cavities with charges, and linked everything with detonator cord so the entire sequence would fire at one pull. By 09:15, both bridges were primed and Billington placed his men in buildings overlooking the approaches. He reminded them the goal was delay, not a battle. Blow the bridges and escape. At 09:38, the first German tanks appeared on the eastern road. 4 Tigers moved in a line with SS Grenadiers following in half-tracks. Billington waited until the lead Tiger reached 30 yards from the first bridge, and then he triggered the detonator. The blast tore the center of the steel bridge apart, sending massive sections crashing into the river. The shockwave echoed along the valley, and the Tiger screeched to a halt at the shattered edge. Peiper himself was said to be inside that lead vehicle. He climbed out, surveyed the ruin, then looked across the gap where Billington's men were retreating through Thioplan. He then began laughing. His laughter cut through the cold air as he muttered those words that spread across the entire 6th Panzer Army within hours. Those damned engineers, officers repeated it. Radio operators repeated it. By night, every SS soldier in the northern thrust of the Ardennes offensive knew about the American engineers who refused to leave a single bridge standing. But Peiper was relentless. He ordered his column to swing south again, hunting for any crossing the Americans had overlooked. His intelligence officers identified a small bridge at Neuf Mule about 3 miles from Thioplan, and they believed it might be undefended. Perrin was informed at 1000 hours that Peiper was racing toward Neuf Mule. Only 1 platoon from B Company guarded that sector under Lieutenant John Kirkpatrick with 19 men. They had plenty of explosives, but the bridge had not yet been wired. Kirkpatrick radioed that he needed at least 45 minutes to place charges, yet Peiper could reach the bridge in 30 minutes or less. The timing did not work, yet Perrin told him to continue. Even partial damage would slow the enemy. Kirkpatrick and his engineers arrived at Neuf Mule at 10:15 and found a steel truss bridge spanning a narrow creek. They hauled crates of explosives onto the structure and began working at once. Truss bridges required precision. Blow the wrong joint and the bridge might sag but stay intact. Blow the right connections where the vertical beams met the lower chord, and the entire span would collapse. They worked in teams without speaking, only using hand signals as the distant rumble of German engines grew louder. By 10:30, they had placed 8 charges, though a proper demolition needed twice that many. Time was gone, so Kirkpatrick ordered the existing charges to be linked. As his men ran the firing wire back to the detonator, a German scout car burst from the tree line only 100 yards away. The driver saw the engineers and braked hard. Kirkpatrick pulled the detonator. 6 charges exploded. 2 failed. The bridge buckled and sagged, dropping 10 feet, but it did not fully collapse. The German vehicle reversed and vanished. Kirkpatrick radioed Perrin, reporting partial success. The crossing was damaged, but might still be repairable. Piper would likely send his pioneer engineers to inspect and attempt a temporary fix. Still, the delay was hours long, not minutes, and that alone crippled the rapid timetable Piper needed. By noon on December 17th, the German advance, which was supposed to cover 60 miles on the first day, had barely moved 15. Bridge after bridge had been blown or damaged. Road after road had been blocked or mined. Wherever the SS Spearhead turned, another team of American engineers was waiting to delay them. Perrin shifted his companies like pieces on a chessboard. A company reinforced Stavelot where another major bridge stood. C Company fortified a key road junction at Verbremont, which controlled 3 routes west. B Company stayed mobile, ready to plug any sudden weakness. Casualties climbed not from firefights, but from the demolition work. Staff Sergeant Paul Hinkle was killed placing charges at Stavelot. Corporal Michael Chen was wounded by machine gun fire while cutting detonator wire. Private First Class Anthony Delgado fell from a damaged span into the river and drowned. Yet the battalion continued because every minute gained across the valley meant thousands of American lives saved. Perrin watched reports come in as Piper struggled, and his offensive slowed to a crawl. The harsh arithmetic of war was shifting, and the 291st had become the barrier holding together the collapsing American line. Kirkpatrick and his men knew the injured bridge at Nuff Mule might still offer a crossing if German engineers worked fast, so they retreated to defensive ground while sending updates to Perrin, who understood the larger danger for Piper, could repair the structure or build a temporary span and continue his push west, though every hour lost weakened the entire German timetable. By noon on December 17th, Kampfgruppe, Piper had traveled far less than the 60 miles demanded by its operation plan. The German Spearhead was already behind schedule because 3 bridges had been destroyed, and 1 had been badly damaged, and every detour forced the tanks deeper into narrow forest roads where traffic jams grew worse with each turn. Perrin spread his men along the valleys, watching every approach road. A company fortified the town of Stavelot, where another bridge crossed the Ambulv River. C Company held a vital junction at Verbremont, which allowed access to 3 possible westbound routes. B Company stayed flexible, moving like fire brigades to wherever the next German thrust appeared. The engineers had fired very few rifle shots. Their weapons were explosives and courage and timing. Yet the losses were already painful. Staff Sergeant Paul Hinkle died while placing charges on a bridge at Stavelot when German artillery struck the area. Corporal Michael Chen was hit by machine gun fire while cutting detonator wire at another site. Private First Class Anthony Delgado fell from a damaged span into the cold river and drowned as his squad tried to rescue him. Their deaths weighed heavily on the battalion, but the men pressed on because the fate of thousands of American soldiers depended on slowing the German assault. The engineers were stretched across miles of rough terrain and worked under constant threat as German vehicles probed every road. Piper radioed 6th Panzer Army headquarters at 1300 hours, requesting updated intelligence, scouting reports, and even air reconnaissance, because he was increasingly frustrated by the American engineers who seemed to anticipate his every move. His tone remained professional, but it was clear the delays were strangling his offensive. Fuel was running dangerously low because his vehicles spent more time idling on blocked roads than advancing. His infantry was tired. His schedule was collapsing, but Perrin faced a crisis of his own. His battalion had begun the day with roughly 4,000 pounds of explosives, and by midday more than half had been used. Additional supplies were stuck in traffic jams behind the front because retreating American units clogged the roads. Perrin calculated that he had enough explosive material for perhaps 6 more bridges, maybe 8, if his men placed charges with absolute precision. After that, the battalion would have nothing left to destroy crossings, so he ordered his supply sergeant to gather any demolitions abandoned by retreating units. They scavenged minefields left by other engineers. They gathered unused charges from deserted command posts. They even attempted to recover unspent German artillery rounds when safe to do so. They found 200 pounds of TNT at an old ammunition dump near Malmade and 300 pounds of composition explosive near a former staging area. It was enough for a few more bridges, and every ounce counted. Meanwhile, the German advance continued towards Stavelot, where a company of the 291st had prepared the bridge. At 16:30 on December 17th, Piper attacked the town directly. American units attempted to defend the streets, but were overwhelmed by the deep column of German armor. The demolition team had wired the bridge, but hesitated to blow it as American vehicles were still fleeing across the span. When they finally fired the charges, German infantry was already on the western bank. The blast killed 11 SS soldiers, but the span did not fully collapse. German engineers examined the structure and reported they could repair it within 2 hours. Piper finally had a usable crossing. His tanks moved into Stavelot, where they refueled using captured American fuel, and then pushed west intending to try Thioplon again. This time Piper divided his force. One group moved north toward Francorchamps, another south toward Trois Ponts, while the main column aimed west. Perrin tracked these movements through his observation posts, which watched every road and sent updates by radio. But his battalion was now dangerously thin. 600 men defending dozens of possible crossings spread over 20 miles. They could not be everywhere. They could not wire every single span. At Francorchamps, the Germans seized a bridge intact before the engineers arrived. Recon vehicles crossed, and within half an hour they had advanced 2 miles and reported the route beyond was open. They were wrong. Perrin had ordered mines planted across key roads during the night. The first mine exploded beneath a German scout vehicle at 1700 hours. Minutes later, a Tiger tank struck another mine which disabled the heavy vehicle and blocked the narrow road. Piper's northern detachment stalled. To the south, Piper attempted another thrust, but every crossing had already been demolished by American engineers. The Liane Creek was too deep for tanks to ford, and its banks too steep to climb. Piper's southern detachment halted. Only the central column continued inching forward. As they pushed west, they reached a roadblock held by a company of the 291st. 40 engineers armed only with rifles and 2 Browning machine guns faced the lead German assault. At 1800 hours, SS Grenadiers attacked, expecting little resistance. Instead, a company held firm, firing at 300 yards and cutting down the first wave. 2 German half-tracks were disabled by concentrated small arms fire. The firefight lasted 17 minutes until the Americans were at risk of being flanked, and the company commander ordered a withdrawal to a fallback position 500 yards west. Before leaving, they detonated a massive road demolition of 1,500 pounds of explosives buried under the pavement. When a Tiger tank rolled over the hidden charge, the explosion hurled the 60-ton machine off the road and killed the entire crew while blasting a crater 30 feet across. The German advance halted again. Piper had been moving since dawn, and after 12 hours he had traveled only 22 miles. His orders demanded 70 miles by nightfall. He was almost 50 miles behind schedule. His vehicles were low on fuel, and his formation spread across 10 miles of narrow roads. Everywhere he turned, another bridge was destroyed or another road mined. At 1900 hours, headquarters ordered him to push on, but he finally halted for the night to gather his scattered forces and resupply. The Germans expected the Americans to retreat deeper into the forest during darkness. They assumed morning would bring renewed momentum, but while they slept, Perron's engineers moved in silence. They wired more bridges, set more charges, planted more mines, built new observation posts, and prepared for another day of delaying the most dangerous armored force in the Ardennes. The German push continued through the late afternoon as Peiper captured Stavelot at 16:30, after fierce attempts by American units to slow the advance, and the engineers who had wired the bridge. They waited as long as they could because American vehicles were still crossing, and when they finally triggered the explosives, German infantry had already reached the western bank. And although the blast killed 11 SS soldiers, the structure held enough strength for German engineers to repair it within 2 hours, which meant Peiper now had a functional crossing, and his tanks surged into Stavelot to seize fuel, then pushed west, while he split his force into 3 separate drives, one toward Francur and one toward Trois Ponts, and one following the main road toward Thioplin for another attempt at breaking through. Perron watched these movements unfold on his maps through constant updates sent by his observation posts, yet he understood clearly that his battalion was stretched to the breaking point for 600 men, could not guard every possible crossing in a network of twisting forest roads spread across 20 miles. They had to choose their positions and trust in timing and luck. At Francur, the Germans reached a small bridge before American engineers could wire it, and they seized it intact and immediately sent reconnaissance vehicles across to probe westward. They traveled 2 miles without meeting resistance, and reported a clear route, yet they had no idea they were driving into a minefield that the 291st had planted the night before. At 1700 hours, a scout vehicle triggered the first blast, and 3 minutes later, a Tiger struck a second mine that tore its tracks apart and blocked the narrow road completely. Peiper's northern drive halted. His southern drive toward Trois Ponts met disaster of another kind because every possible crossing along that valley had already been blown by American engineers, and when German tanks reached the Liane Creek, they discovered deep water, steep muddy banks, and no chance for a tank to ford the terrain, so the southern drive stopped. Only the central column continued to push west and soon encountered a determined roadblock held by a company of the 291st. The engineers had 40 men and 2 Browning machine guns and only rifles besides. No artillery, no tank support, yet they held firm when German half-tracks carrying SS Grenadiers advanced at 1800 hours. The engineers opened fire at 300 yards and swept the first wave from the road and disabled 2 half-tracks through concentrated fire. The battle lasted 17 minutes until the Germans began to flank the position, and the company commander ordered a withdrawal to a fallback line 500 yards west, where he had prepared a road demolition using 1,500 pounds of explosive buried beneath the pavement. When the first Tiger rolled over that spot, the blast hurled the 60-ton vehicle into a ditch, shattered the turret, and killed the crew instantly while leaving behind a crater 30 feet across that no vehicle could cross. The German advance stalled yet again. By this time, Peiper had been driving his column for 12 hours and had advanced only 22 miles, though his orders demanded 70 miles by nightfall. His timetable was shattered, his armor scattered across 10 miles of forest road, his fuel dangerously low. The 6th Panzer Army sent new instructions at 1900 hours urging him to maintain momentum because the northern thrust depended entirely on his breakthrough. Yet Peiper could not push farther in darkness with his forces separated and his supply chain confused. He halted for the night at Stavelot. His officers believed the Americans would retreat westward in darkness and that fresh progress would come at dawn. They were wrong. While the Germans rested, Perron unleashed the full effort of his battalion. Engineers worked without lanterns. They wired every remaining bridge in their zone. They planted new mines across narrow roads. They dug firing pits. They moved supplies to hidden positions. They strengthened roadblocks. They used silence and speed to transform the terrain once more into a deadly maze of traps. At 2200 hours, the long-awaited supply convoy reached Perrin carrying 1,800 pounds of C, 400 and 600 pounds of TNT, and this precious resupply meant the battalion could now destroy at least 10 more bridges. Perrin immediately sent runners carrying boxes of explosives to every company position and ordered every remaining crossing within reach to be prepared for demolition before dawn. Casualty reports also reached him in the darkness. Sergeant William Foster had been killed by a sniper while watching German movement near Stavelot. Private Robert Yamamoto was wounded when his jeep struck a mine on a blacked-out road. Corporal James Murphy had vanished after encountering a German patrol near Trois-Ponts, and his squad did not know if he had been captured or killed. The battalion had now lost 11 men killed and 37 wounded since the attack began. These numbers were small compared to infantry losses, but for a battalion of 600 men, every death cut deeply. Still, the engineers held their lines. Perrin also received word that other German armored columns were making gains on parallel fronts, with the 2nd Panzer Division pushing toward Houffalize and Panzer-Lehr advancing toward Bastogne. The entire German offensive stretched across 60 miles, and Kampf Grob Peiper was only one part of it, yet it remained the most dangerous part because it was the intended spearhead. If Peiper reached the Meuse River, the Allied armies would be split in two. First Army Headquarters asked Perrin how long he could hold. He studied his remaining explosives, his casualties, and his map. He estimated 3 days, maybe 4 if fortune stayed with them. After that, the roads would be open. The Germans would pour through, but not tonight. Tonight, the 291st held firm across the frozen forests, preparing for another desperate day of fighting, where their only weapons were skill explosives, and the will to stand against the most feared armored column in the Ardennes. The night settled across the Ardennes, yet the work of the 291st did not slow, for casualty reports continued to arrive, and each one carried a heavy weight upon Perrin, who knew his battalion was fighting the most important delaying action in the entire northern sector of the German offensive. Sergeant William Foster had fallen to a sniper while monitoring enemy movement near Stavelot. Private Robert Yamamoto had been seriously wounded when his jeep struck one of the many mines scattered along the dark frozen roads. Corporal James Murphy had disappeared after his squad encountered a German patrol near Trois-Ponts, and no one knew if he had been taken or killed. By then, the battalion had lost 11 men killed and 37 wounded since dawn of the 17th, and though the numbers were small compared to the torn American infantry divisions, every loss was felt deeply because the engineers fought as small teams scattered across wide terrain, with each man carrying responsibility far beyond his rank. Perrin received more updates from 1st Army Headquarters concerning movements of other German divisions as the 2nd Panzer Division drove toward Houffalize, and Panzer-Lehr sought to punch through near Bastogne, and the entire offensive stretched across 60 miles of Belgian forest and farmland. Kampf Grob Peiper remained the cutting blade of the northern assault, and if Peiper reached the Meuse, the Allies would face disaster. First Army demanded to know how long Perrin could keep the enemy contained. He studied his maps and the status of his explosives, and predicted 3 days of resistance, perhaps 4, if fortune held, and if his men continued their relentless pace. At 0300 hours on December 18th, Peiper resumed his advance, forcing his column northwest toward a small town called Leglaise, where another key bridge stood spanning a narrow section of river. Reconnaissance reports suggested the Americans had not yet prepared the town for a serious defense, and the Germans hoped to seize the crossing quickly. Yet C Company of the 291st had already reached Leglaise by midnight with 28 engineers under Lieutenant Harold Parker, who worked through darkness to rig the bridge with charges and prepare firing positions in nearby buildings. At 03:15, Parker radioed Perrin to report that everything was ready and that he awaited permission to engage. Perrin approved and reminded him to hold fire until the last possible moment, then destroy the bridge and withdraw. At 30 German infantry began probing into Leglaise, believing it abandoned as they found empty buildings and no visible defenders. Peiper sent 3 Tigers forward across the main road, believing he had caught the Americans unprepared. The lead tank approached within 200 yards when Parker gave the order to open fire. Machine guns erupted and cut down the SS infantry accompanying the tanks. The Tigers then accelerated, hoping to reach the bridge before the engineers could act. Parker waited until the lead tank closed to 50 yards. Then he fired the detonator. The entire center of the bridge vanished in a thunderous blast that sent stones and steel flying high into the air. The lead Tiger stopped just short of the crater, and Peiper himself was believed to be in that vehicle, staring across the gap in disbelief, because once again the engineers had beaten him by minutes. By dawn Kampfgruppe, Peiper had been halted at 6 different crossings. Abemont, Thieplen, Nuffmühl, Stavelot, Francorchamps, Leglaise, each one destroyed or badly damaged. His fuel reserves continued to shrink. His units were strung across 10 miles of narrow forest roads. His infantry was exhausted. His vehicles were blocked by empty spans and deep craters. The northern thrust of the Ardennes offensive was collapsing, but Peiper was not finished. He turned his column south toward a small crossing at Chenu, hoping the engineers had not reached it in time. Yet Perrin had predicted this move, and at 0500 hours he ordered B Company to race to Chenu. Lieutenant Frank Ray took 14 engineers and loaded explosives into 2 jeeps which drove through icy darkness, guided only by map, compass, and memory. They arrived at 0545 and immediately carried C4 onto the Stone Arch Bridge, which was old but strong and vulnerable only at its keystones. Ray directed his men to place 6 charges along the arch and run a single detonator cored back to a barn 50 yards away. As they finished, they heard the engine noise of approaching armor. At 0612, the first Panther appeared, followed by a long line of half-tracks and tanks. Ray radioed Perrin with an estimate of at least 40 armored vehicles. He waited as the first 3 Panthers rolled onto the bridge. Then he fired the detonator. The explosion shattered the arch and dropped all 3 Panthers nearly 30 feet into the river. The crews had no chance as fire and water swallowed the vehicles. German infantry fired wildly through the morning light, but Ray withdrew his men through forest trails, reaching their rally point safely. This final destruction at Chenu sealed Peiper's fate, for by noon on December 18th, his column was trapped in a pocket between the 82nd Airborne Division to the north, the 30th Infantry Division to the west, and the 7th Armored Division to the south. He lacked fuel to advance or retreat. The larger German offensive continued elsewhere, yet without Peiper breaking through, the entire plan unraveled. At 1500 hours, First Army ordered Perrin to hold positions around Malmedy and to prevent any German attempt to reinforce Peiper. The engineers prepared new firing lines and destroyed additional roads. But at 1600 hours, German artillery began heavy bombardment of Malmedy with 150mm shells that pummeled buildings, roads, and supply vehicles. The engineers sheltered in basements and stone cellars while explosions echoed for 3 hours. At 1730, a patrol from C Company discovered a horrifying scene near the Borgness crossroads. Dozens of American prisoners from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion lay shot in a field with their hands raised. 17 survivors were found hiding in a nearby cellar. The massacre hardened the resolve of every engineer in the 291st, because now the mission was not only to delay the enemy, but to stop a unit that murdered prisoners. Perrin informed his battalion and reminded them that their work had already saved countless lives by preventing Peiper from reaching new American units. The engineers knew they had become the deciding factor in stopping the most feared German battle group on the northern front. By the morning of December 19th, the fate of Kampfgruppe Peiper had become painfully clear, for the German spearhead was exhausted, low on fuel, and surrounded on 3 sides by American units that had moved into blocking positions during the night, while the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion tightened its hold on every route that might allow escape or reinforcement. The 82nd Airborne Division held the high ground to the north. The 30th Infantry Division controlled the western approaches. The 7th Armored Division held the roads to the south. Piper could neither advance nor withdraw, and his tanks sat helpless across the frozen valleys, while fuel trucks struggled through miles of wrecked roads. Perrin received confirmation that the engineers had succeeded in their grim assignment. Piper had been stopped not by tank destroyers or heavy artillery, but by 600 combat engineers who refused to let a single bridge remain intact. Yet the battle was not over. German artillery opened fire on Malmedy at 1600 hours with heavy shells that pounded buildings, tore apart supply vehicles, and forced civilians and soldiers alike into any basement or stone cellar that offered shelter. The bombardment lasted nearly 3 hours and shook the town again and again. When the firing finally faded, a reconnaissance patrol from C Company discovered the terrible aftermath of the Malmedy massacre near the Borgness crossroads, where dozens of American prisoners from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion lay frozen and murdered in snow. 17 survivors were found hiding in the basement of a small cafe. Some were wounded and all were terrified. They explained that SS troops from Piper's force had executed prisoners after making them stand in a field with their hands raised. News of the massacre spread through the 291st within hours. The engineers had been operating under the harsh logic of battlefield necessity, yet now the mission carried a deeper weight because the enemy they faced had crossed a line of cruelty that ignited a fierce determination in every man. Perrin gathered his officers and then addressed the battalion. He told them exactly what had happened at Borgness. He explained that their demolition work had prevented Piper from reaching more American units, and that the delays they created had saved countless lives. He told them the 291st would continue to fight until every German position in the sector collapsed. That night, the engineers strengthened their defenses around Malmedy. They repaired roadblocks damaged by artillery. They placed new mines in frozen earth. They prepared fallback firing lines in case German infantry attempted a breakout. Though they were tired and cold, their resolve strengthened with every hour. At dawn on December 19th, the weather cleared and American fighter bombers roared overhead. These aircraft had been grounded for days by clouds and snow, but now they hunted the trapped German vehicles that lined the roads between Stavelot and Staumont. They struck tank after tank and half-track after half-track, while the engineers watched from distant ridges. Smoke drifted through the valleys as explosions echoed across the forest. By midday camp, Gropp Piper was no longer an armored threat. Vehicles burned where they sat. Infantry huddled in scattered pockets, with no way to escape or resupply. Piper ordered his remaining men to abandon their tanks and flee east on foot through the woods in small groups. They left behind Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, armored cars, and the supply vehicles that had once formed the sharp edge of the northern German offensive. By December 21st, Piper's battle group had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The German offensive continued in the southern sector, where other divisions pressed toward Bastogne, yet without Piper breaking through in the north, the entire strategy unraveled. Perrin knew his engineers had played a decisive role in stopping the thrust, but the coming weeks still demanded enormous effort, for winter tightened around Belgium, and the 291st continued to build new bridges, demolish damaged ones, and clear mines left by both armies. The next major challenge arrived in early March of 1945, when Allied forces drove deep into Germany and reached the Rhine River, which stood as the last natural barrier before the German heartland. Every major bridge across the Rhine had been blown by retreating German forces, leaving American divisions crowded along the western bank. Yet at the town of Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge still stood, though damaged by failed demolition charges. On March 7th, the 9th Armored Division dashed across the span and seized the eastern bank, creating a precious foothold inside Germany. First Army recognized the opportunity and ordered every available unit to reinforce the bridgehead. Traffic poured across the weakened structure in an unending stream of tanks, trucks, and artillery. The Ludendorff Bridge shuddered under the weight, and inspectors warned that it could collapse at any moment. Perrin received his next assignment on March 8th. The 291st would construct a full tactical treadway bridge across the Rhine at Remagen within 48 hours, so that the immense flow of troops and armor could continue, even if the Ludendorff Bridge failed. The Rhine at Remagen stretched nearly 900 feet across, with strong current cold water and steep banks that made the work extremely dangerous. The treadway bridge would require inflatable pontoons, steel decking and anchoring lines secured deep in the riverbed, all assembled under enemy artillery and machine gun fire from heights east of the river. The task pushed the skills of the battalion to their limit, yet the engineers did not hesitate, for they understood once again that the fate of entire divisions rested on their work, and that only speed, precision and courage would allow the Allied armies to surge into the heart of Germany and end the war that had consumed the world. The task facing the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion at Remagen was unlike anything they had confronted before, because the Rhine River was wide, fast and brutally cold, and the enemy held high ground that allowed constant observation of the crossing site. Yet Perrin and his engineers began their work on the morning of March 9th with the same determination they had shown in the Ardennes, for they knew that the survival of the Ludendorff Bridge was uncertain, and that tens of thousands of American troops needed additional ways across the river. The treadway bridge required 32 inflatable pontoons, each more than 30 feet long, anchored against the powerful current, then linked together with heavy steel roadway sections. The battalion divided into teams. Some inflated pontoons on the western bank, others prepared anchor lines, others assembled the treadway platforms. As soon as the first pontoon touched the water, German artillery opened fire from positions on the eastern hills, sending shells exploding into the river and along the bank, yet the engineers pressed forward and waded into the freezing water with ropes and tools, while machine gun fire snapped above their heads. The Rhine flowed at 7 miles per hour, strong enough to drag a man under if he slipped, and the water temperature could kill through hypothermia in minutes. Yet the engineers worked chest deep in that icy current, fastening anchors and guiding pontoons into alignment. By noon on March 9th, they had completed 100 feet of bridge, but German artillery increased its fire as heavier 150mm rounds burst around the construction site, tearing holes in the water and sending geysers over the engineers. One shell killed Private Edward Morrison and injured several more, yet the work did not stop, because the Ludendorff Bridge showed worsening cracks and inspectors feared it might collapse in less than a day. At 1300 hours, Luftwaffe aircraft appeared, diving toward the crossing in desperate attempts to destroy the bridge and the treadway under construction. American anti-aircraft crews shot down 2 attackers, but others slipped through and dropped bombs close enough to hurl engineers into the river. Some men disappeared in the current and were never recovered. By 1500 hours, the bridge spanned 300 feet, yet the pace remained too slow to meet the 48-hour deadline, and Perrin radioed First Army, requesting additional engineer elements. 2 treadway companies, the 988th and the 998th, arrived near 1600 hours, bringing fresh men, new pontoons and more steel sections. The reinforcements doubled the speed of construction. Teams worked simultaneously across multiple sections, pushing pontoons deeper into mid-river, while others assembled roadway panels in long lines ready to slide into position. The German guns thundered through the night, with shells landing every few minutes and searchlights sweeping the river to expose the men working in the water. Yet the engineers accepted the danger, because they needed the light to continue through darkness. At 300 hours on March 10th, a direct hit destroyed 4 pontoons waiting on the western bank and killed 3 men from the 988th Company while wounding 11 others. The explosion weakened the supply of pontoons, but did not halt construction, as new ones were hauled forward in the dark. By dawn, the bridge stretched nearly 700 feet, and only the final 200 feet remained, yet this last portion was the hardest, because it lay under direct German observation, and every movement drew artillery fire. Lieutenant Harold Dawson volunteered to lead the 15-man team that would complete the eastern end. At 0630, they crawled onto the last section carrying tools, chains and anchor lines as shells crashed into the river around them. 3 men were wounded, yet Dawson pressed his team onward until the pontoons were in place and the treadway panels secured. By 0700 hours, the eastern bank was anchored. Still, one last connection remained in mid-river, a delicate task requiring the 2 unfinished halves to meet perfectly without twisting in the current. Engineers from both sides worked from floating platforms, pushing, tugging, adjusting, and shouting above the roar of artillery. Hours of effort followed as they fought the current to align the final treadway section. At 1000 hours on March 10th, the last panel slid into place, and the full 1,032-foot treadway bridge across the Rhine held steady in the water. It had been completed in 32 hours under constant artillery fire, aerial attack, and freezing conditions. First Army immediately began sending vehicles across. Tanks rumbled over the steel plates. Truck convoys followed. Artillery rolled forward. Within hours, thousands of troops crossed into Germany, expanding the Remagen Bridge head, which allowed the Allies to strike deep into the Ruhr industrial heartland. 1 week later, on March 17th, inspectors' warnings proved true when the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed from accumulated damage and strain, killing 28 engineers working to reinforce it, and injuring 93 more. Yet by then the Treadway Bridge and 2 additional pontoons. Bridges carried all traffic across the Rhine, ensuring the advance did not stop for a single hour. Over 125,000 American soldiers crossed at Remagen using bridges built and defended by combat engineers, including the men of the 291st, who had already earned their reputation as bridge killers in the Ardennes, and now proved themselves bridge builders in Germany. Their skill resolved even the most impossible challenges, and their endurance allowed the Allied armies to surge into the heart of a collapsing Reich with unstoppable momentum. The war in Europe would end 8 weeks later, but the legacy of these engineers was already carved into the river. They had crossed under fire, and into every soldier who reached the eastern bank because of their work. The Treadway Bridge at Remagen became the lifeline of First Army as thousands of vehicles rolled across its floating steel spine, and the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion continued to strengthen the structure while directing traffic and fighting off constant German artillery fire that rained down from the heights east of the river. Yet the engineers endured the bombardment because they understood that the fate of the Allied advance depended on keeping every crossing open. By March 18th, the Remagen bridgehead had expanded into a powerful foothold, and American divisions pushed deep into the Ruhr region, capturing factories, towns, and rail hubs that kept the German war machine alive. The men of the 291st remained at the river for days, supporting construction of 2 additional pontoon bridges and maintaining the treadway against the river's harsh current. When the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17th, killing 28 engineers and wounding 93 more, the Treadway Bridge instantly became the essential artery carrying all traffic east. The collapse was a grim reminder that engineering victories often carried a heavy price, but it also proved the wisdom and workmanship of the Treadway teams who had finished their bridge before disaster struck. Over the next several weeks, the Remagen bridgehead allowed more than 125,000 American troops to cross the Rhine and push into the center of Germany, where entire German formations began surrendering as their supply lines failed and their defenses collapsed under Allied pressure. The 291st moved forward with the army continuing to build bridges across smaller rivers, repair captured roads, and clear minefields left behind by retreating German units. Their pace never slowed despite exhaustion, cold rain, and the ever-present danger of booby traps. By the time the war in Europe came to an end in early May, the battalion had completed 73 bridges during the campaign, 19 of them under direct enemy fire, and they had cleared more than 7,000 mines while demolishing 6 major bridges to halt German advances. Out of 600 men, 8 had been killed in action, and 93 wounded, yet their achievements reshaped the outcome of 2 decisive campaigns. After the surrender of Germany, Colonel David Perrin returned home and resumed his civilian life working as a railroad engineer for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which later became Penn Central, and he eventually rose to the position of vice president and chief engineer. In 1989, he published a memoir titled First Across the Rhine, in which he recounted the work of the 291st in stopping Kampfgruppe Peiper and building the Remagen bridges. His writing captured the determination, fear, and triumph that shaped the battalion's journey from the freezing forests of the Ardennes to the cold, rushing waters of the Rhine. The book later became required reading at the United States Army Engineer School, where generations of combat engineers learned how the courage and precision of a single battalion had changed the fate of an entire front. Colonel Perrin died on April 7th in the year 2012, only 3 months before his 95th birthday, and he was buried with full military honors. His legacy lived on in every engineer who studied his work and in every soldier whose path forward depended on a bridge built or destroyed at exactly the right moment. Though the Treadway Bridge at Remagen no longer stands, the stone towers of the old Ludendorff Bridge remain preserved as a museum overlooking the Rhine. Inside those towers, visitors can see photographs of the 291st hauling pontoons under fire, laying steel treadways across a river filled with artillery bursts, and standing proudly beside the Presidential Unit Citation awarded to the battalion for its actions during December 17th through December 26th. Displays include Perrin's Silver Star, his Purple Heart, and the documents that recorded the battalion's role in stopping Kampfgruppe Peiper. The museum preserves the story of 600 engineers who fought with explosives and courage and timing rather than rifles or tanks. Visitors stand on the same ground where the engineers once fought the river and the enemy with equal determination. They look out across the Rhine and imagine the freezing spray drifting over the men who worked waist deep in the current, while shells exploded around them. They learn how the 291st turned a near-catastrophic German breakthrough into a costly failure during the Battle of the Bulge by destroying bridges at the precise moment needed to stall an entire armored column. They learn how those same men built the longest tactical bridge of the war under constant enemy fire at Remagen, allowing the Allies to flood into the heart of Germany. The story endures because it reveals that even in the darkest moments of war, when armies clash across continents, the outcome can hinge on the actions of small, determined teams who understand that their work may decide the future. The engineers of the 291st did not fight for glory or recognition. They fought because bridges needed to fall or rise, and because they knew that without their skill and their nerve, thousands of soldiers would die, and the war would last far longer. Their courage shaped history, and their story continues to inspire all who learn how a battalion of builders became one of the most decisive fighting forces of the European theatre. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.